Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the What Now Show. I am your host, Suryansh Basumalik, and today we are joined by a member of the MMA media industry. He is one of the most prominent ones out there. He is Mike Bohn, a senior sports reporter senior sports reporter who's worked with several different agencies like USA Today, MMAjunkie.com, one of the most prominent MMA media houses in out there, and of course Rolling Stone as well. Mike, it's a pleasure having you on. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yep, amazing. So, Mike, let's. I wanted to get started. Digging right down from the bottom, right? When you were moving into your prospective careers and choosing where you wanted to get into, how did you pick journalism and what got you into MMA?
It was honestly just kind of happened organically, if we're being honest. I mean, I was just a big MMA fan. Like, I think a lot of people in the industry kind of are, who eventually find jobs, whether it's in the media side or management or anything besides actually getting in the cage and fighting. It kind of comes through a passion of the sport. And yeah, like I was, in my high school years getting ready to graduate, and I'm trying to figure out what I want to take in university. And in those first year or two of university, I was kind of just aimless, taking like random courses, did like general studies, tried some sociology for a year, and nothing was really a good fit. And kind of on the side during one of my summer breaks, I, with a few friends, started like a little blog spot website where we'd write up our predictions for the fights and do that kind of thing. And I was the one who took it the most seriously of anyone in the group. I was, collecting everyone's picks and doing the editing and all that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed it. And then when I went back to university for my third year, I looked into taking some journalism classes, some creative writing classes, those kind of things. And while I was taking those, I was kind of balancing a website that I created that was, a little bigger than the blog that I had originally, and was managing that on the side and doing all my work and for school, and they kind of just blended together, and it really just took off from there. I managed to get my foot in the door at like a MMA Mania website, which is owned by the same company that owns Bloody Elbow and MMA Fighting, and then was there for a while and kind of just took off. Eventually MMA Junkie had an opening and I went over there. I mean, that's kind of the condensed version of it. There's some stuff in between there, but yeah, it really did just happen organically for me, I'd say.
So do you still work on that on the website you started with your friends, or is that in the past now?
No, that was, I mean, in the past for a while. It really just started as us doing, like I said, just like a blog bot thing that was just some predictions. And then I was like, oh, I'd like to maybe do some more stuff. So I had a friend that I went to high school with that actually did some like graphic design for websites and whatnot. So he made me like a little more official type of one, and I was running that for maybe a year or two. I think it was closer to two, but once like a real opportunity came along that was kind of paying and stuff like that, kind of just pushed it to the wayside, because I'm sure all the outlets that were wanting me to do work were wanting the content to go up on their site and not my own independent one.
Right. So, I'm sure that when you've started when you've developed yourself as one of the more prominent writers out there in the MMA journalism industry, you've worked with several different media outlets, right? And in your time doing so, has there ever been any level of conflict that you've been working with a certain house while you're working with another? So has there been any such clashes that someone wanted you to write in one place exclusively, and uh, has anything like that happened, and if so, how'd you deal with it?
It's not too bad for me personally. I mean, a lot of these type of sites, and I think it's kind of like any industry when it comes to like media or things like that. It kind of depends on what contract you're on. So like originally I was just a freelancer, which gives you a lot more opportunity to write wherever you need to. You'll see some of the people in this industry, like James Lynch, who I think is a great reporter who
Yeah.
does great interviews. He does interviews for a number of different outlets, and that kind of gives you that freedom via being a freelancer. But when I became full time with USA Today and MMA Junkie a few years ago, that kind of closed off that door, and I wasn't doing much of it really, to be honest. Anyways, I've been pretty loyal and given most of my work to MMA Junkie and whatnot. But I do some stuff with Rolling Stone as well. And the reason that doesn't really come out as a conflict is because they're not like overlapping, they're not kind of the same, they're not the same audiences, which I think is, if anyone's kind of trying to get into the industry and they run into that potential situation, I think that's generally what your boss would say to you, or what they would want to have written into a contract. Sometimes you can do work outside of the specific outlet, but as long as it's not, cross contamination in a way where you're really just taking something that maybe should be on one place and doing it over there. And for Rolling Stone, just the tone of the stuff between MMA Junkie and USA Today is just so different that it hasn't ever really come up as an issue for me, thankfully.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned Mike James Lynch. My apologies. He was one of our guests on, and what you said really resonated with me because that's also what he spoke about. How how what it was like working with different media outlets, and when you're writing for multiple different places and you're doing work for multiple different people, and you're writing articles left, right, and center full time. Of course, there must be the trouble of deadlines and multiple other extraneous variables that may come into consideration as you're writing them. So when you look back upon when you were writing these articles and you were uploading them on a deadline, because it's all about who gets to the story first and uploads it and how quickly it gets clicked on. um how, other than the battle to the line, what's been the most tricky aspect of journalism that really struck you without you noticing it?
I think it's just the diversity of, in 2021, the diversity of skills that are needed if you really want to be in the top level of this industry. I get a lot of people that message me and asking for advice and things like that. And I try to be as straightforward and open with anything that I could possibly do to help really anyone, because I've had people doing the same to me when I was on the come up. So I definitely understand that. But I think a lot of people don't really understand the broad scope of what you need to do. Like here, you're doing a podcast, you probably know how to do audio stuff and compile this together and those kind of things. But like on my side, you need to know how to write, you need to know how to shoot video, edit copy, do audio files, do social media, do like all these different things. So it's not like a singular, it's not just, oh, I'm going to interview someone and write up a story. I mean, that's obviously part of the job too. But in 2021, I mean, these media outlets, if anyone wants a job at kind of a bigger outlet and to be sustainable, that's something you definitely have to be able to do. And as you kind of mentioned, James Lynch is obviously kind of a one-man band in terms of what he does. He shoots his own stuff, he produces it, all that kind of stuff. Fortunately, at MMA Junkie, we do have like a bit more of a team environment where we do have people whose roles are specific to video or things like that, and writers and editors and whatnot. But you still need to know how to do everything. And that's something that over time is, not that I was kind of oblivious to that coming in, but once you actually just see it and having to learn all the skills is something that maybe I didn't fully understand coming in. I thought maybe it was just interviewing people and writing up stories and trying to break news and things like that, and watching the fights and writing up recaps. But there's a lot of things that go into it behind the scenes.
Completely understandable and relatable, to be honest, because while you did mention getting into the social media aspect of it, editing your own content, and when you were off that mentality of having to be at the point where you could just write your stories and interview your guys, when you had to start getting into the nitty gritties of it, if hashing out the content, and uh, editing every aspect of it, making sure it's shined, which usually someone would expect someone else to do, but you end up doing bearing the brunt of it. When you were getting used to handling that level of work ethic, was it something you did not want to do initially, or is it something that you got settled into easily? Because you have a lot of these stories about people trying to get into getting into the industry, but then the social media aspect, the editing aspect of it, it gets really tricky for some people, and it goes out. So what was your experience like with it?
For me, it's been pretty smooth, honestly, just because for me, like, this is my life. This is what I'm most passionate about. I'm really have dedicated a lot of time and energy and effort into this. And I really care about what I'm doing in all sorts of facets, care about covering the sport the right way, presenting a strong product, all those different kind of things. So for me, it's not really something that caused me like a ton of stress, or I was like throw my hands up, I don't want to do this type of thing. I know that it's part of the gig, and if you want to rise up through the industry and become one of the few people who are able to do this full time, because those opportunities I know are incredibly rare, ones that I'm fortunate to have. So you need to work very hard and be committed if you want to stay in that place. And I think once you kind of get to the upper tier of doing the type of coverage that we do, and in the volume of coverage that we do, you need to be fully understanding of the commitment, the dedication, the sacrifice, and the hard work, and all that stuff that it takes. So I was well aware of that coming in. Not to say that it's always, every day is sunshine and lollipops. I mean, everyone has their hard days like everyone else. There's days where you don't want to do things, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing is perfect in this world. But for me, generally speaking, I'd say it hasn't been a difficult adjustment or difficult time commitment or things like that, because this is ultimately what I want to be doing.
Right. And you spoke about the upper tier of the group of journalists up there reporting mixed martial arts, and in my opinion, you happen to be one of them. And you, when you're in that upper tier, you've spoken to so many different people, you've worked with so many different fighters, with your interviews, with your stories, and I'm sure you've shared multiple good moments with these fighters. So when you look back at the number of people you've interviewed, who are some of these fighters that you'll take back, your most memorable interviews away from? Who are the ones that really stuck with you?
Man, there's been a lot at this point. It's kind of hard to almost like kind of put them all in order, but two that really stand out to me is one, John Jones, when I went and spent 2 days with him in Albuquerque. And this
Mhm.
was back, I think, in 2016 or 17, I want to say. It was when he was on the comeback from his hit and run that caused him to be stripped of the UFC title and all these different things. And I went and kind of got to see him do actually the final hours of his community service work, which was speaking at a children's detention center and kind of opening up about his life. So I got to kind of shadow him for a day, go watch him train afterwards, and then sit down and do like a 2-3 hour interview with him. That was really fascinating. It was for a Rolling Stone feature that I did. And just being able to kind of see that insight was really fascinating to me, to be able to spend that much time with him. It was really an amazing opportunity. It's kind of crazy how sometimes these things work, right? Like it's supposed to be this big story about his comeback and going into the rematch with Daniel Cormier, and how all these things have kind of gone back in order for him, and his life is going to be smooth sailing going forward. And then 3 weeks before the fight, he gets pulled over for that drag racing incident,
Yeah.
which I'm sure people have seen the video of. And then Daniel Cormier gets injured and pulls out of the fight and gets replaced by Owen St. Preux. And it's just like all the things that I really did for this story to make it happen pretty much fell by the wayside. I had to like rewrite 90% of the story, which was pretty crazy, and do like a follow-up interview with John and stuff. So that one, just given all the logistics of getting out to Albuquerque, setting that up for the couple days and spending all that time, and then having it all kind of go to crap and have to pick up the pieces and figure out how to make it something that's still going to be worth all the effort I put in, was definitely just something that sticks with me a lot. And then another project I really like doing, and I'm sure people know that I obviously have been interviewing Dustin Poirier for a very long time. He's someone that has really given me a lot of incredible access. And leading up to the fight with Habib back in October 2019 or September 2019 in Abu Dhabi, we did like a series together called Dustin's Diaries for MMA Junkie. And it was basically a weekly blog for the final, I think, 5 weeks leading up to the fight with Habib. So we talked on the phone for 20, 30 minutes every single week leading up to the fight. He gave me some really great insight into his life, his camp, all that kind of stuff. And then once we got to Abu Dhabi, he gave me like a 20, 30-minute sit down in his hotel room the week of the fight. And just that meant a lot to me. Just the fact that he, going into the biggest fight of his life, literally on the other side of the world, of course, it didn't go his way, but that he was willing to give me that much time and access really meant a lot to me. So that's another thing, another project that really sticks true to me.
Yeah, interesting. And that's actually what I want to talk to you about next, right? the sit down and the amount of time that you're given with fighters, right? I mean, I'm sure that when you were on the come up as well, and you were DMing fighters, getting in touch with the different representative agencies and management agencies, and trying to set up your interviews. How stressful was it for you? What was your experience with when you were on the come up and you didn't have as much shine in the industry? Setting up these interviews with other guys. What was that whole process like for you, and how did you deal with some people pulling out or not responding, or flat out saying no, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate to a degree. I think the landscape is different nowadays. Like, really, when I was kind of forming those relationships and trying to reach out to anyone or everyone to do interviews, like, um, Twitter and stuff wasn't as big as it is now. And honestly, like, my goal at the beginning was to send like 5 to 10 fighters a message on Twitter every day, or Instagram, which wasn't really, as big of a thing then, and just asking for an interview. And if I got one response every day or two, like, that would be awesome. And that's kind of what ultimately really got it started for me a little bit. Be like, hey, can you DM me your number? And I think that would be a lot more challenging to do now. Like, the first person who gave me an interview was actually John Anik, who of course isn't even a fighter, he's just a UFC commentator. And then the first fighter I got was Benson Henderson, and that was before his first fight with Frankie Edgar in Japan. I think it was UFC 144.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was kind of my strategy, was just reaching out blind. And of course, like, you would send a message to a manager here or there, but the landscape was a lot different then. It is a little more different now. There's some fighters that you can reach out to directly and set things up, and other ones who they want you to go through management, which causes them headaches. Sometimes they want you to go through the promotions. There's all those kind of things. So it's really kind of just touch and go, and depends on what kind of relationships you have with certain people, managers and stuff, that make it the flexibility open up in those opportunities. But yeah, it's definitely hard to pin down. I mean, you kind of said it there. There's people who no show. There's people who show up late when you're on a very strict time schedule. Like, these little things, but I've just come to learn that these are fighters we're dealing with. They're not the most punctual people. You'll always say about Conor McGregor, he doesn't wear those watches to tell the time. I know that much.
Yeah, it's something I relate with to the highest of orders, because the experience you narrated to me is something I personally do relate with as well. And speaking of dealing with different barriers, one of the most impactful barriers must have been the COVID barrier it placed on physical interviews, and going to different places to work with different fighters. And of course, you were one of the very few group of journalists who was fortunate enough to go to Abu Dhabi, to Fight Island, and work with the fighters over there. So I spoke with multiple fighters who spoke about the COVID related restrictions and procedures that had to be undertaken to keep them safe. So when you got the green light to enter Abu Dhabi as well, and work with these fighters, what was the process like on the media end of it? What was it like working with the UFC staff over there, getting into the media rooms? What was that whole procedure like? Because I understand must have been quite different as compared to that of the fighters.
It was, yeah. I mean, I hadn't covered a show previously since March of last year, which was UFC 248. So the last fight I saw live was Israel Adesanya versus Yoel Romero. So I was excited to wash the taste out of that one out of my mouth a little bit, because that was a rough fight to watch. But in all seriousness, going over there, it was a tricky process in terms of having to get COVID tests. You have to, all your equipment that you're sending over there, you have to send like information about it to the UFC, who in turn gives it to the Abu Dhabi government to make sure you're not bringing in equipment into the country to sell, or whatever the case may be. Just all these little things. But I mean, like, the quarantines were were not ideal, having to do 36 hours in Las Vegas, then go straight to a plane where you're doing 16 hours in the air, and then you get there and do another 48 to 50 hours in the hotel room. So there was a lot of just sitting around in the rooms and those kind of things. But of course, it was to ensure the safety of the situation and the legitimacy of their bubble over there, and keeping it safe, which they did an amazing job of. From my understanding, not a single person over there, whether it was staff, fighters, cornermen, hotel staff, UFC staff, there was no positive tests. So they do it the right way. And generally speaking, like it's a lot different during like the Las Vegas shows right now, where there's just all the virtual media days and things like that. Now, at least on Fight Island, you were able to do some in-person stuff because of the bubble setup. Like you could stand side by side with someone and do an interview, which was definitely a slice of reality that was much needed, and turned back the clock a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it was mostly just the frequent testing, the quarantines pre-departure and upon arrival that were the main changes. But once you're on the ground, besides having to wear a mask like pretty much all the time, unless you're doing specific work, things like that, which I don't mind at all, it felt pretty normal, to be honest, which was a nice break.
Interesting. Now let's change gears a little bit. We spoke earlier about how you had some amazing experiences with fighters. You spoke about John Jones, you spoke about Dustin, you spoke about Benson. However, how about the bad ones, right? I'm sure everyone has those few fighters who are like, oh, I hate dealing with this guy, or maybe something along the lines of it was a bit tricky to deal with this guy, and it wasn't as fun interviewing this guy. So when you've been interviewing multiple people, I'm sure you've had a few interviews where you haven't had the best experience dealing with them. Of course, you had a lot of issues with regards to people being late, as you mentioned. What other tricky experiences have you had with fighters or anyone else you've interviewed?
It really just depends. I mean, I think you need to have a firm understanding of like the each individual that you're getting involved with. Like there's some people that are just not going to be very giving when it comes to interviews. It's like pulling blood from a stone. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to get that quote you want. You're not going to get that headline. And I don't want to specifically call anyone out or anything
Yeah,
here,
sure.
but I think you can probably understand, you probably know some of the personalities that are out there that are a little tricky to just get anything out of. And that's who they are. And in one ways, that's like a fun challenge, because you're like, this person isn't going to give anything, and I want to make it my personal task to give them something or to get something from them. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, that's just the main issue, is trying to get some of these people who clearly don't want to be there, especially on fight week when the UFC, like today, they're going to have a media day this afternoon. That's about 20 hours prior to the fighters having to step on the scale. This is the hardest part of their weight cut. This is the day they probably want to be talking least to people. So there's that kind of challenge there, that they clearly don't want to be there, but it's your job to try to talk to them and get stuff out of them. So I'd say that's one of the more difficult parts. But for the most part, I don't think I've had too many bad experiences. I'm one of the fortunate ones. Of course, there's like an interview you're not super happy with here or there, or you get a scoop that you're not able to confirm and someone else breaks it before you. Like these just little elements that come in, but it's nothing that I honestly stress about or lose sleep over. It's just part of the gig.
Right. And moving on to with regards to, one of the more interesting things you've done. I want to get into one of your examples, one of the few people you've spoken to in specific. You spoke to Jake Paul, right? And you've been in the MMA industry, in the fight business, there's a lot of I mean, I'm sure you follow the news, I'm sure you read a lot of articles as well. There's a lot of this argument about how, the whole Jake Paul in the fighting industry is a bit of a sham. Ben Askren's giving him the time of day. Michael Bisping's saying his own piece. Dylan Dennis is saying his own piece. There's a whole ruckus going on. The MMA industry is mixing with the boxing bit. The YouTube's mixing with the boxing bit. And when this whole spinneroonie is going around, and you've spoken with Jake Paul. I'm sure you've had a lot of interaction with him outside the main recording as well. So what was that whole experience like? Getting into it. What was your whole headspace going on to the fact that, you're dealing with naturally a tricky person to deal with. Just seeing the kind of attention you're getting, and seeing some of the comments on the main interview as well. People were giving you a lot of shit for oh, why are you giving Jake Paul the time of day? So what was it like
Yeah.
dealing with all of that?
Yeah, man. I don't think I've ever got so much hateful feedback for ever interviewing or any piece of content I'd put out, which I understood and I was expecting. I mean, you look at anything that is put out there with him, he just brings like a whole different level and sector of haters and people who dislike him, which I guess is why he is who he is at the moment. But it's interesting. I mean, for me personally, with the Jake Paul thing, I was approached about doing a story for him for Rolling Stone around the fight, which is obviously a little more maybe fitting to his world as like a former rapper and the YouTube personality and entertainer and stuff. So I am gonna have something coming out on that, but I thought, well, I'm talking to this guy, I might as well make it extra useful and record an interview for MMA Junkie as well. And that's why I didn't go, if you watched, I didn't go like the crazy, just try to get as many clickbaity headlines out of this guy as possible. I tried to ask him serious questions about why are you doing this? What's your motivations, coming from where you're coming from, having the resources, and all these little things. And I thought out of all the interviews I've seen with him, he was pretty sincere and straightforward with where he's coming from. I mean, love it or hate it, whatever. But people need to understand for this particular thing, we didn't cover Jake Paul versus Nate Robinson because that's not our world. We're covering Jake Paul for this fight because he's fighting a former Bellator and one championship champion and a guy who was fighting in the UFC in some extremely big fights, and Ben Askren, who's a very well-known MMA fighter. That enters our sphere of coverage with him fighting an MMA fighter. I interviewed Ben Askren a few weeks ago, didn't get nearly the feedback or criticism of talking to Jake, and I understand why. But I mean, for me as a journalist, I'm trying to figure out why this guy is compelling to other people and why he is really causing so much of a ground stir. And to me, that's really interesting. I mean, I know there's the sector of people that think this is just a pure sport and all those kind of things, but it's not. We know combat sports is a degree of entertainment, and the people who sell tickets, who bring the audiences, who get the interest via website clicks or downloads or all these things, those are the people that to a degree we need to give attention to. I mean, if people didn't click on anything that was Jake Paul related or didn't care about it, we would see that and it would probably not reflect in all these different elements, and we wouldn't, maybe even Ben Askren probably wouldn't even be fighting him. So it's just the reality of what it is in combat sports. I mean, people are, some of the feedback, like you're not giving attention to other fighters, you're overlooking other fighters. I mean, go to the MMA Junkie website and the MMA Junkie YouTube page. There's going to be 20 stories per day or multiple interviews per day going out that have nothing to do with Jake Paul, that are strictly MMA related. If you don't want anything to do with this guy or you're not interested, you can obviously just swipe through your feed or not click it or not watch it. It's not gonna hurt you one way or the other. But the reality is that there is a massive interest around this guy right now. We'll see what it ends up turning out to be. I mean, he's the one who's choosing out to call out Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz and all these people. I'm sure that's what causes a lot of frustration with certain people, is that he's coming in and calling out the biggest stars in our sport, and he's not taking like the quote unquote like real path to being a fighter and like fighting similar guys with 1-0 records from X part of the world, where coming up like a natural amateur would, or whatever the case may be. But we've seen this time and time again with combat sports, whether it was Brock Lesnar coming in, and yes, he did have like an amateur wrestling background, but most of his name was through WWE. He came into the UFC after one fight and was fighting for the title after 3 fights. We saw Conor McGregor, who had 0 professional boxing matches, go over and box Floyd Mayweather. Like, these are just some of the things that happen in combat sports, and we'll see what Jake Paul can do in the actual ring if he's able to beat a Ben Askren, and what could possibly come on the horizon of that. But right now, this is a guy that has entered our sphere, is fighting or boxing against MMA fighters, and that brings him into our world of coverage, and that's just the reality of the situation. I'm doing my job. There's not every single interview I've done in my life I wanted to do. It's like anyone who has any job. Is there every single element or every single day of your job that you enjoy, that you're wanting to do the most? No, but there's certain things you have to do because that's part of your job. And I'm not saying that I despise Jake or got absolutely like shoved down my throat or something, but these are just the realities. Sometimes you do things that you're really excited about. Sometimes you do things that are just part of the job. And that's, I guess, where I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, I saw it in a very similar light because it's his persona, and if he's being able to sell his tickets, if he's being able to get the attention of the community, he got Ben Askren's attention. Ben Askren definitely, I'm sure for a fact, Ben Askren thought he had something that he'd take the fight and not just shrug it away. Because if he had nothing, no one would give him the time of day itself. And the fact that the fact, and I gotta tell you, because you've and on behalf, and I think I speak on behalf of the entire social media community when I tell you this, congratulations, right? You got probably the most sincere interview and probably the most politically correct interview of probably the most hated personality, arguably in the modern day in the social media community right now. To which, well done. I mean, it's a pretty big feather in your cap if you ask me. And
Thank you.
moving on from which, you've been working with Rolling Stones for quite some time, and you've been doing these specials as you mentioned. You know, when you've been transitioning between these different types of stories, right? When and you're switching gears between these smaller articles and these quick stories that you have to get to get out these beat-based articles, and then these opinionated articles, and then you've got these specials with Rolling Stone where you make these 3 hour pieces. You worked with John Jones for quite an amount of time. You're doing this with Jake Paul. When you're drawing a comparison between the kind of work it takes on and the kind of dynamic it is revolving around the Rolling Stones work and the kind of dynamic around the MMA junkie work, does it get a little mixed up? Does it get a little messy working with 2 different types of stories at the same time, or is it something you've learned to balance?
Yeah, I think I've learned to balance it pretty good over this time. I mean, it'll be come August 1st, it'll be 8 years with MMA Junkie. And then it'll be, I think, right around that same time, it'll be 7 years doing stuff infrequently for Rolling Stone. So I've been kind of doing this balancing act for a while. And yeah, it's a little different. I mean, obviously, the two great distinctions is MMA Junkie is more so like a content machine. It's your daily every day. Like it's for more so the hardcore fan, the MMA junkie, no pun intended, but it's the one who wants, all the insights, not just UFC, but Bellator, one championship, PFL, everything like that. I mean, I don't think we've missed covering a UFC or Bellator show on the ground in like 2 or 3 years at this point. So we're on a nice streak. We give all the in-depth content. We interview the people that no one's ever heard of to the absolute top stars, whereas Rolling Stone is obviously more of a mainstream outlet. They're not looking to do a story on the first fighter on the prelims of a fight night or something like that. Like that's just not the reality of what their brand is. They're looking for the more marquee names, more in-depth features, multiple interview stories, things like that, that just take on a little bit of a different tone. So when I pitch stuff to Rolling Stone, I think I have a pretty clear idea of what they're looking for and what I'm looking to present at this point. We've kind of got it down pat in that sense. Where on MMA Junkie, I mean, we're covering literally every inch and corner and space of the sport from top to bottom. So I think it's kind of clear in my own mind what fits where.
Right. And you've worked, in your time working with all of these news outlets, there's of course one thing that, every reporter can relate to, which is deadlines, right? And even though it's not, even though there are self-imposed deadlines, there's always going to be, these time delays for some reason or the other, where, you're out of time and you have to finish this. So, when have you ever felt any of those kind of pressure from the higher ups in chain of command of either Rolling Stones or USA Today or whoever you've worked with, of, getting it done on time, a bit of the work pressure of submitting different articles here and there. Of course, you've been able to balance it now, but early on, getting used to the whole dynamic, how difficult was it?
It was a bit of a challenge, but honestly, the deadline aspect isn't too big in our world. I mean, it's more so just like get it up as fast as you can. But there has been some situations like obviously MMA Junkie is owned by USA Today, which is a pretty significant newspaper. So there is occasionally times where we will get stories into print, which is where the hardest deadlines fall in. Like, if you're going to have a story that's going to appear in Friday's newspaper, you need to make sure you have your print copy in by the day prior at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whatever the deadline is at that given time, or on your time zone or whatever. So that's kind of where deadlines have more come into place. But generally speaking, more, it's not too bad in this industry. It's not like NBA, which I've done some coverage as well for. I've done a lot of stuff for USA Today in the NBA world. And that's where deadlines more so come in, like a game recap or things that you need to have prepared for, whether it's their online or their print. So I would say that's where the deadlines come in harder. But for us, everything's just happening so quick in real time. If Conor McGregor gets knocked out by Dustin Poirier in the main event, you need to just make sure that recap, which you're probably know that you're working on before the fight even starts, kind of goes. It needs to be done just as soon as possible. So those are kind of the things where just maybe not hard set deadlines that you would think of like traditionally being in a newsroom or something come in, but just speed and getting content up.
You mentioned the NBA, right? And on a much lighter note, who are you rooting for this season? Who are you rooting for this season?
Man, it's tough. I mean, my Raptors, of course, are my Toronto Raptors aren't really in Toronto this year, so they're in Tampa. So that's kind of I mean, of course, they got a place. I like to see them succeed and stuff. It would probably be them, I guess. That's the team that really um, I've become the main follower of. Of course, I've covered them for like 5 seasons. I'm from Vancouver originally, and we got our Vancouver Grizzlies taken away when I was like 6 or 7 years old. So I didn't even really get to like become a true fan of the sport or of that team. So once I moved to Toronto, that's kind of become my adoptive team. And then, of course, being able to cover that championship run was one of the most amazing sports journalism experiences that I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I would say that's the team I lean towards wanting to see succeed. But I think they got a rough couple of years ahead of them right now.
They really do. And myself, I'm more a fan of the long range teams. I mean, it's tough not to be a fan of the Nets right now. I'm really hoping Clay can return for the Warriors because they're on a roll right now with Damian and
Steph
Curry.
looks unbelievable.
Yeah, they're on an amazing run. The Lakers, of course, they're dominant as well. The Bucks, decent-ish. I mean, but anyhow, rather than just journalism, right? Of course, you spend a lot of time and effort into the journalism bit, but outside of journalism, I'm sure there's a lot of other things you might be interested in. Or outside of your own profession and interest in journalism, where else do you have interest in? What else do you like to do other than just reporting?
Man, I mean, just in personal life, like this job really does consume a lot of your time. I mean, you are basically, especially these days in the pandemic era, the UFC is running a show basically every single weekend. So, like, if you want to do this job, say RIP to your Saturday nights for a very long time, because that's just what comes with that. So, when you're on kind of on the daily grind, of course, like I like to just spend time with family, friends. I play Xbox when it's nice and not the winter time in Canada. Try to get out and enjoy the sun and swim and just try to be active to a degree and not become someone who's just sitting on their couch 24 hours a day in front of the computer, because that's obviously probably not the best thing for your mental health over a very, very long stretch. So yeah, I mean, just anything I could do to enjoy the people around me, when you can see them, obviously, ideally, because it's pretty crazy times right now. But yeah, I mean, I'd say that's generally it. I'm not an overly complicated man.
And it really was a pleasure getting to know a lot more about you, a lot more about your experience in the journalism industry. I'm sure our viewers had a lot to take away from it. I certainly did. I myself, honestly speaking, I read a lot of your articles. I make sure to check who's the author of it was, and a lot of them were actually written by you. And amazing. I myself am a fan of your work, and thank you so much for doing this. It's a pleasure having you on. And one thing we do with all of our guests before we let them go, if there's anything else you would like to say, if there's anything you would like to say, anyone you want to shout out, anything you want to say in the next few minutes, all you. Thank you for doing this, and whatever you have to say, go for it.
No, I appreciate you, man. Not a ton to say. I just, I, it's an honor to kind of get this platform and be able to speak with you. I mean, I know a lot of people do reach out about wanting to talk or asking for advice and all these things of kind of how to make it in this industry. And I try to be as open and straightforward as I possibly can with all those people and give them the honest advice because I was in that exact same position a few years ago. I was reaching out to the Luke Thomases, the Ariel Hawanis, trying to figure out what would be the best way to kind of forge a path. And they were gracious with their time to me. So I think it's only right that I kind of be gracious back to those same people. And it is a different industry now compared to when I got into it. Just some of the hurdles, the job vacancies, those kind of things. It is a tough nut to crack, but I tell people that first and foremost, if there's anyone watching this kind of trying to seek advice or trying to figure out how they can make this happen, just know that it does. The grind is a grind, and you need to be willing to dedicate yourself 100% to that because it becomes very time consuming and a challenge, but that's the only way you can really make yourself stand out. And there's people who have reached out to me asking for advice years ago, and some of those people are now my colleagues, like the Farah Hanoons, the Nolan Kings, who are, in my opinion, two of some of the best up and coming journalists right now in our industry. So don't feel discouraged. As I said, there's people who have probably done the exact same thing, reaching out, and they're now my colleagues. So that's absolutely possible. And if anyone wants that advice, you can email me, Mike Bohn MMA at gmail.com, or hit me up at Twitter, Mike Bohn MMA, or on Instagram, Mike Bohn MMA, and I'll do everything I can to kind of fall back with you and give any advice I can.
Yep. Once again, yeah. Thank you for saying what you said, and once again, thank you for joining. It's a pleasure having you on. Thank you all for watching. I'm gonna put Mike's handles and the MMA junkie links and all of that fun stuff down below. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you on the next one. That's what that was.